The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when Deputy Linda Kozlov first received the call about Julian Brenner. It was March 14th, 2023, and the caller, Julian's wife Rebecca, had that particular tone in her voice that veteran officers recognize immediately, the moment when concern transforms into dread. Julian hadn't come home from his morning hike in the Cascade foothills near Olympia, Washington. His truck sat in the trailhead parking lot, keys still in the ignition, his thermos of coffee sitting untouched on the dashboard. Julian was 52 years old, a surveyor for the county, and known for his meticulous nature. He'd been hiking the same trail every Tuesday and Thursday for 7 years, rain or shine. The trail wasn't particularly challenging, a 4-mile loop through Douglas fir and western red cedar, emerging at a viewpoint overlooking the valley where he and Rebecca had bought their house 23 years earlier. He'd proposed to her at that very spot, one knee in the mud, both of them laughing as a light drizzle turned into a downpour. The search began within hours. Volunteers from 3 neighboring counties joined the effort, combing through dense undergrowth and checking every ravine, every creek bed swollen with spring runoff. Julian's daughter, Natalie, drove up from Portland, her 7-year-old son asking every few minutes when Grandpa would come home. For the first week, Rebecca barely slept, standing at the kitchen window at all hours, watching the driveway as if her vigil alone could summon him back. If you're following Julian's story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us share these important mysteries. Search and rescue teams found nothing, no torn clothing, no signs of injury, no indication that Julian had strayed from the main trail. His cell phone last pinged from a tower near the trailhead before going dead, its battery drained. The weather had been unusually cold that week, temperatures dropping into the 30s at night, and everyone understood what that meant for someone potentially injured and exposed to the elements. After 2 weeks, the official search was scaled back. After a month, it stopped entirely. Rebecca returned to the trail herself, sometimes twice a day, walking every inch of the loop until she could navigate it with her eyes closed. She left notes tacked to trees, laminated against the rain. "Julian, come home. We love you. We're waiting." Natalie begged her mother to stop, worried she was losing herself to the obsession, but Rebecca couldn't abandon the one place where she felt close to him. She noticed every broken branch, every disturbed patch of earth, cataloguing them in a notebook she carried in her jacket pocket. The months that followed were a special kind of torture, the not knowing. Julian's brother, Frank, flew in from Oklahoma to help Rebecca sort through the practical matters, the mortgage, the insurance policies, the question of when, or if, to file a death certificate. Frank had always been the practical one, a former Marine who approached problems with military efficiency, but even he struggled with the impossibility of the situation. How do you mourn someone who might still be alive? How do you hope when every passing day makes hope seem more foolish? Summer arrived, then fall. The leaves turned gold and red before falling, covering the trail where Julian had vanished. Rebecca went back to work at the elementary school where she'd been a librarian for 15 years, but everyone could see she was somewhere else, her attention constantly drifting to the windows, to the clock on the wall. Parents stopped asking about Julian, not out of callousness, but because they didn't know what to say anymore. Natalie visited every weekend, bringing her son, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, even as the absence grew heavier. Winter came early that year, snow falling in November and staying through December. The trail became impassable, buried under 2 feet of powder. Rebecca spent Christmas with Natalie's family in Portland, sitting at their table and pushing food around her plate, forcing smiles for her grandson's sake. At midnight, alone in the guest room, she whispered happy anniversary to the darkness, 24 years married, 13 months since she'd seen her husband's face. She touched the gold band on her finger, thinking about the matching one Julian wore, wondering if it was still on his hand, wherever he was. Deputy Kozlov never closed Julian's file. She kept it on her desk, reviewing it monthly, checking national databases for John Does, following up on every reported sighting, no matter how improbable. She'd worked missing persons cases before, too many of them, and she knew the statistics. After this long, Julian was almost certainly dead. But something about the case nagged at her, some detail she couldn't quite identify, like a word on the tip of her tongue. The snow melted in late February, earlier than usual. By early March, the trail had dried enough for hiking, and Rebecca returned to her routine with renewed intensity. 1 year, 1 full year since Julian had disappeared. She'd planned to hold a memorial service at the viewpoint, to finally accept what everyone else already believed, but she couldn't bring herself to make the arrangements. Accepting his death felt like betrayal, like giving up on him. Frank called her every Sunday, checking in, never quite saying what they both thought, that it was time to move forward, time to start healing. But Rebecca wasn't ready. She'd taken Julian's favorite flannel shirt from the closet and wore it on her hikes, the fabric soft and faded, smelling faintly of his aftershave even after all these months. She'd started talking to him as she walked, narrating her day, sharing stories about Natalie's son, asking him questions she knew would never be answered. Natalie worried her mother was having a breakdown. She'd suggested therapy, grief counseling, even medication, but Rebecca refused everything. "I'm not grieving," she insisted. "Grief is for people who are gone. I don't know that he's gone." The logic was circular and desperate. But it was all Rebecca had. She'd read stories online about people who'd disappeared and returned years later. A man in Romania who'd come back after 30 years. Elderly women found in submerged cars decades after vanishing. The cases were rare, miraculous even, but they existed. As long as they existed, hope existed. March 14th, 2024, arrived cold and clear. Rebecca took the day off work and drove to the trailhead at dawn, the way she had exactly 1 year earlier when she'd first realized Julian was missing. She carried flowers, purple irises, his favorite, and a thermos of coffee, the same breakfast blend he'd loved. The parking lot was empty except for one other vehicle, a park ranger's truck. She recognized the ranger, a young man named David Chen who'd been part of the search team. "Mrs. Brenner," he said, approaching carefully, "I figured you might be here today." 1 year, Rebecca said simply. The words hung in the cold air. "I'm sorry we never found him. I think about your husband every time I'm on patrol up here." Rebecca nodded, grateful but unable to speak. She'd cried so much in the past year that she sometimes felt hollowed out, empty of tears. David walked with her to the trailhead, not saying anything more, just present, and she appreciated that more than he could know. At the trail marker, he squeezed her shoulder once and headed back to his truck, leaving her alone. The hike took her 90 minutes, slower than usual, because she stopped frequently, touching trees she knew Julian had touched, standing at creek crossings where he'd photographed salamanders and wildflowers. The forest was coming back to life after winter, trilliums pushing up through leaf litter, Douglas squirrels chattering in the canopy, the sharp green smell of new growth everywhere. Julian would have loved it. He'd always said March was his favorite month, when everything was potential, when the world remembered how to be new. At the viewpoint, Rebecca stood at the railing Julian had helped install years ago as part of a volunteer trail maintenance crew. The valley spread out below, houses and farms, and the silver thread of the highway connecting everything. She placed the irises on the railing and opened the thermos, pouring coffee into the cup lid and setting it beside the flowers. It felt both foolish and necessary, this ritual for someone who might not be dead, might not even be here. She stayed until noon, sitting on the damp ground, her back against the railing, watching clouds move across the sky. She told Julian about Natalie's promotion at work, about their grandson learning to ride a bike, about the leak in the bathroom she'd finally gotten fixed. She told him she missed him so much, it felt like a physical wound, something that should have healed by now, but instead seemed to cut deeper every day. When she finally stood to leave, her legs stiff from sitting, she noticed something at the edge of the clearing, a flash of blue that didn't belong to the forest palette. She walked over, pushing aside ferns, and found a scrap of fabric snagged on a blackberry vine. Blue, synthetic material, the same color as the rain jacket Julian had been wearing. Her heart hammered as she carefully freed it, holding it up to the light. It could have been anyone's jacket, she told herself. But she knew. She knew. Rebecca pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called Deputy Kozlov. "I found something," she said, her voice breaking. "I found something." Within an hour, the viewpoint was crowded with officers and search teams. They photographed the fabric, marked the location, began a new search radiating out from where Rebecca had made her discovery. Deputy Kozlov examined the material carefully, comparing it to photos from the original investigation. "It's consistent with what he was wearing," she confirmed, but her tone was cautious. A scrap of fabric after a year meant very little. It could have been there for months, torn off during the initial search, or it might not even be Julian's. The new search lasted 3 days and yielded nothing else. No more clothing, no evidence of a camp or shelter, no signs that Julian had ever been in that area beyond the single piece of fabric. Rebecca oscillated between hope and despair, certain one moment that he was alive and close, convinced the next that she was chasing ghosts. Frank flew back out, and this time he didn't try to be practical or comforting. He just sat with his sister-in-law in her kitchen, both of them silent, both of them exhausted. April arrived with unseasonable warmth, temperatures climbing into the 70s. Rebecca had started sleeping better, aided by the medication Natalie had finally convinced her to try. The prescription bottle sat on her nightstand, next to a photograph of Julian from their 20th anniversary. His arm around her shoulders, both of them sunburned and happy after a weekend camping at Lake Quinault. She'd touch the frame every night before turning off the light, a small prayer without words. Deputy Kozlov continued investigating, driven by a hunch she couldn't articulate. She re-interviewed everyone who'd been on the trail around the time of Julian's disappearance, reviewed traffic camera footage from the highway, checked hospital admissions within a 200-mile radius. Modern missing persons cases left digital footprints, credit card transactions, cell phone pings, social media activity. Julian had left nothing. It was as if he'd stepped off the trail and out of existence entirely. One afternoon, while reviewing the case file for perhaps the 100th time, Kozlov noticed something she'd previously overlooked: Julian's watch. In every photo Rebecca had provided, he wore the same watch, a mechanical Seiko, nothing fancy, but distinctive with its black face and silver band. It had been a gift from Frank after Julian survived a car accident in his 20s, a reminder, Frank had said, that time was precious. Julian never took it off. Kozlov called Rebecca. Julian's watch, was it mechanical or battery-powered? Mechanical, Rebecca answered immediately. He had to wind it every morning. It was this whole ritual he had, part of his coffee routine. He'd wind it exactly 40 times, said that's what the manual recommended. Why? Just confirming details, Kozlov said, but her mind was racing, a mechanical watch that needed daily winding. After 13 months, if Julian had died in the wilderness, the watch would have stopped within a day or two of his disappearance. She wasn't sure why that detail mattered, but it felt important. Rebecca found herself thinking about the watch constantly after that conversation. She could picture Julian at the kitchen counter every morning, the soft clicking sound as he wound the crown, his concentration absolute for those few seconds. He'd been meticulous about it, almost superstitious. The one time the watch had stopped because he'd forgotten to wind it during a particularly stressful week at work, he'd acted like it was a bad omen. That night, their hot water heater had died, and Julian had joked that the universe was tied to his watch. She'd laughed at him then, but now the memory made her chest ache. Natalie had started bringing up practical matters again, gently but persistently. They needed to think about the future, about finances, about when to hold a memorial service. "Mom, it's been over a year," she said one evening, sitting at Rebecca's kitchen table. "I miss him too. God, I miss him so much. But we can't live in limbo forever. It's not healthy." "I know," Rebecca said, and she did know. The rational part of her brain understood that Julian was gone, that she needed to accept it and begin rebuilding her life. But the rational part of her brain seemed very far away, drowned out by the stubborn, desperate part that refused to believe her husband had simply ceased to exist on an ordinary March morning. She'd been having dreams about him, vivid, detailed dreams, where he was trying to tell her something, but she couldn't quite hear him over background noise. In one dream, he was standing at the viewpoint, waving at her, and she could see his watch gleaming on his wrist. She'd woken from that dream crying, Natalie shaking her shoulder, telling her it was okay. It was just a dream. But it hadn't felt like just a dream. It had felt like a message. Frank called on April 15th, his voice tight with forced cheerfulness. "Hey, Rebecca, listen, I've been thinking. Maybe this summer we could all go somewhere together. You, me, Natalie and her family. Somewhere Julian liked. Not as a memorial, just as a family trip. What do you think?" Rebecca looked out the kitchen window at Julian's truck, still parked where she'd brought it home from the trailhead over a year ago. She couldn't bring herself to sell it, though it made no practical sense to keep it. "Maybe," she said, which they both knew meant no. "You can't wait for him forever," Frank said quietly. "He wouldn't want that." "I'm not waiting," Rebecca lied. I'm just living my life." But she was waiting. Every time the phone rang, every time a car pulled into the driveway, every time she heard footsteps on the porch, some part of her believed it would be Julian. She'd imagined the reunion 1,000 different ways, him exhausted and injured but alive, him with some incredible story about amnesia or being trapped, him simply walking through the door as if no time had passed at all. The scenarios were increasingly implausible, but she couldn't stop conjuring them. Deputy Kozlov, meanwhile, had developed her own theory, though she kept it to herself. She'd worked enough wilderness disappearances to know the most likely scenarios. Julian had fallen and died from his injuries, or he'd suffered a heart attack or stroke, or, and this was the scenario that seemed most probable, he'd encountered an animal. Black bears weren't uncommon in the Cascades, and while attacks were rare, they happened. A man surprised by a bear, killed quickly, his body dragged away from the trail. It would explain the lack of evidence. But the theory didn't fully satisfy her. There was something about Julian's case that didn't fit the pattern of typical wilderness deaths. The abandoned truck with the keys still in it, the lack of any scent trail for the cadaver dogs, the total absence of physical evidence despite weeks of searching. It was as if Julian had been erased rather than lost. Late April brought storm systems rolling in from the Pacific, turning the trails muddy and treacherous. Rebecca stopped hiking for a few weeks, the first time she'd stayed away for more than a day since Julian's disappearance. She told herself she needed the break, that she'd been obsessing unhealthily, but the truth was that she was afraid. Afraid of finding more evidence, or worse, of finding nothing at all, afraid that if she accepted Julian's death, she'd be killing him a second time. May arrived, and with it, the anniversary of the day Rebecca and Julian had first met. 30 years ago, at a community meeting about watershed conservation, both of them earnest and young and convinced they could save the world through proper land management practices. They'd argued about salmon habitat restoration, their disagreement escalating until they were both laughing at their own intensity, and Julian had suggested they continue the discussion over coffee. The coffee had turned into dinner into months of late-night phone conversations, and before Rebecca quite understood how it had happened, she was in love. She drove to the trail on May 3rd, the first time in weeks. The parking lot had 3 other cars, a reminder that life continued, that the world hadn't stopped just because hers had. She hiked quickly, not stopping to examine every detail as she usually did, driven by a restlessness she couldn't name. At the viewpoint, the irises she'd left in March were long gone, scattered by wind and rain, but she placed fresh ones anyway, yellow this time, bright as summer. 30 years, she said aloud to the empty clearing. 30 years since you convinced me to give you a chance. Best decision I ever made. Her voice cracked. Worst day of my life, losing you. I don't know how to do this, Julian. I don't know how to let you go. She sat down, closing her eyes, feeling the sun warm on her face. For the first time in months, she let herself imagine a future without him, not the bleak, empty future she'd been inhabiting, but something else. A future where she could remember him without drowning in grief, where his absence was a permanent scar, but not a constant wound. It felt both like betrayal and like the only way forward. When she opened her eyes, she saw a man standing at the edge of the clearing. Her breath caught. The build was wrong, too tall and too young, but for one impossible second, her heart believed. The man waved, apologetic. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. I'm just passing through. He continued on the trail, and Rebecca sat very still, waiting for her pulse to slow, angry at herself for the hope that had flared and died so quickly. Natalie came to visit that weekend, finding her mother in the garage sorting through Julian's tools. Mum, what are you doing? Your father would hate how disorganized this got, Rebecca said, arranging wrenches by size. He always kept everything just so. Natalie leaned against the workbench, watching her mother work. You know it's okay to get rid of some of this, right? We could donate the tools to the community college, their woodworking program. Dad would have liked that. Rebecca's hands stilled. I'm not ready. You've been saying that for over a year. Then I'll keep saying it until it's true. Rebecca's voice was sharp, defensive, and immediately she regretted it. I'm sorry. I know you're trying to help. Natalie moved closer, putting her arm around her mother's shoulders. I'm not trying to erase him. I just want you to be okay. I know, Rebecca whispered. I know. That night, lying in bed, Rebecca made a decision. She would give herself until the end of May, and then she would hold the memorial service. She would say goodbye properly, publicly, and she would start the process of moving forward. It felt impossible, but she knew Natalie was right. She couldn't live in limbo forever. She owed it to her daughter, to her grandson, to herself, and to Julian's memory to find a way through the grief instead of drowning in it. Deputy Kozlov received a call on May 17th from a ranger in Olympic National Park, about 40 miles from where Julian had disappeared. A hiker had reported seeing a disoriented man near Staircase Rapids, acting strangely, talking to himself. The description was vague, middle-aged, white, medium build, but it was enough to warrant investigation. Kozlov drove out immediately, her heart hammering with cautious hope. She interviewed the hiker, a college student from Seattle who'd been camping in the area. He seemed out of it, the student said. I asked if he needed help, and he just looked at me like he didn't understand the question. Then he walked off into the woods. It was weird enough that I thought I should report it. Kozlov and a team of rangers searched the area for 2 days, calling Julian's name, checking every campsite and trail junction. They found nothing. The forest swallowed sounds and people with equal indifference, keeping its secrets. Still, Kozlov filed a report, logged the sighting in the database, kept the case open. She'd promised Rebecca she wouldn't give up, and she was a woman who kept her promises. On May 28th, Rebecca called Frank with her decision about the memorial service. They set the date for June 10th, giving family and friends time to make arrangements. Frank volunteered to handle the logistics, renting the community center, arranging for food, creating the program. Rebecca would write the eulogy, though the thought of standing in front of people and talking about Julian in the past tense made her physically ill. She spent the next week going through photo albums, selecting pictures for a display board. Julian as a young man, skinny and serious in his surveying gear. Julian on their wedding day, beaming, younger than her grandson was now. Julian at Natalie's college graduation, his arm around his daughter, both of them proud. Julian on their last Christmas together, wearing the ridiculous reindeer sweater Natalie had bought him, laughing at something someone had said. The night before the memorial service, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She walked through the house at 3 a.m., touching Julian's things. His reading glasses on the nightstand, his jacket hanging by the door, his mug, world's okayest surveyor, sitting on the kitchen counter. Tomorrow, she would stand in front of everyone they knew and accept his death publicly. Tomorrow, she would close a door that she'd been holding open through sheer force of will. Tomorrow, she would become a widow instead of a wife. The memorial service never happened. At 6:47 a.m. on June 10, 2024, 13 months and 27 days after Julian Brenner disappeared, he walked out of the forest at the trailhead parking lot and stood in front of his truck. The park ranger who found him radioed it in with a voice tight with disbelief. "We have Julian Brenner. He's alive. Repeat, Julian Brenner is alive." Deputy Kozlov arrived at the scene within 20 minutes, her cruiser's lights flashing in the early morning dimness. Julian sat in the back of the ranger's vehicle, wrapped in an emergency blanket, looking exhausted but uninjured. He was thinner than in his photos, his hair longer and shot through with more grey, but there was no question it was him. Kozlov's hands shook as she opened the door. "Mr. Brenner? Julian, I'm Deputy Kozlov. We've been looking for you. Do you know how long you've been missing?" Julian blinked at her slowly, as if translating her words from a foreign language. "Missing?" His voice was hoarse, scratchy from disuse. I went for a walk. I need to get home. Rebecca will be worried." "Julian, you've been gone for over a year. March 14th, 2023. That's when you disappeared." He stared at her, confusion and then dawning horror crossing his face. That can't be right. It was Tuesday. I went for my hike. Tuesday morning." His breathing accelerated, panic setting in. "What do you mean a year? Where's Rebecca? I need to see Rebecca." Kozlov called Rebecca herself, knowing this news shouldn't come through official channels or second-hand. Rebecca answered on the first ring. She'd been awake for hours, dreading the memorial service. "Deputy Kozlov, is everything—" "Rebecca, I need you to sit down. Julian is alive. We have him. He walked out of the forest this morning." The phone clattered to the floor. Kozlov could hear Rebecca's ragged breathing, hear Natalie's voice in the background asking what was wrong. Then Rebecca was back, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure it's him? I'm looking at him right now. It's Julian. He's confused and exhausted, but he's not injured. We're taking him to St. Peter Hospital for evaluation. Can you meet us there?" Rebecca drove faster than she'd ever driven in her life, Natalie white-knuckling the passenger seat, both of them crying and laughing and unable to process what was happening. It seemed impossible, a miracle, a dream they'd both wake from disappointed. But when they burst through the emergency room doors and saw Julian sitting on an examination table, hospital gown hanging loose on his frame, it became real. "Julian!" Rebecca's voice broke on his name. She crossed the room in 3 strides and wrapped her arms around him, holding on as if he might disappear again if she let go. He held her just as tightly, his face buried in her shoulder, both of them sobbing. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry. I don't understand what happened. I don't know where I was." Natalie joined them. The 3 of them tangled together, a year's worth of grief and fear pouring out in tears that couldn't stop. The emergency room staff gave them privacy, understanding that no medical evaluation was more important than this reunion. After the initial examination, remarkably, Julian was in good health, slightly malnourished, but with no signs of serious injury or illness. The questioning began. Detectives joined Deputy Kozlov, along with a psychiatrist and a neurologist. Julian sat in the hospital room, Rebecca refusing to leave his side, and tried to explain what he couldn't understand himself. I remember starting the hike. It was Tuesday morning, March 14th. The trail was wet from rain. I remember thinking I needed to fix the loose board on our deck when I got home. He paused, his brow furrowing. Then it gets foggy. Not all at once, but gradually, like I was there but not there. I remember walking, lots of walking. I remember being cold, being hungry. I remember sleeping under trees, drinking from streams. Do you remember where you were? Did you try to get help? The detective asked gently. Julian closed his eyes, struggling. I couldn't think straight. It's like I was in a fog, like I was watching myself from far away. I knew I should do something, go somewhere, but I couldn't figure out what or where. Every day I'd wake up and think I should go home, but I couldn't remember how to get there. The neurologist leaned forward. Julian, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to answer as best you can. Do you remember what you ate during the time you were missing? Berries, roots. I think I caught fish once, but I'm not sure. It's all so blurry. Did you encounter other people? Maybe. I have these flashes of memory, voices, faces, but I can't tell if they're real or dreams. Over the next several hours, doctors ran tests, CT scans, MRIs, blood work, cognitive assessments. The results were baffling. Julian showed no signs of head trauma, no evidence of stroke or seizure. His memory of events before March 14th was largely intact. He could recall his childhood, his marriage, his daughter's birth, his work, recent conversations with Rebecca. But the past 13 months existed in his mind as a dreamlike haze, disconnected fragments that refused to cohere into narrative. The psychiatrist offered a provisional diagnosis: dissociative fugue, a rare psychological condition where individuals lose their sense of identity and sometimes wander for extended periods. It could be triggered by extreme stress, though Julian and Rebecca both insisted he hadn't been under unusual stress before his disappearance. The diagnosis was incomplete, unsatisfying, more a label for their ignorance than actual understanding. What captivated everyone, though, what became the detail that would follow Julian's story in news reports and internet forums, was his watch. When the nurse catalogued Julian's personal effects, she noted the Seiko on his wrist. It was still running. Deputy Kozlov stared at it, remembering her conversation with Rebecca about the mechanical movement, about the daily winding required. Julian, she said carefully, your watch. It's a mechanical watch, right? It needs to be wound. He looked down at his wrist, at the familiar weight he'd worn for 30 years. Yeah, every morning. 40 wins. When did you last wind it? His expression clouded. I don't remember. I remember doing it Tuesday morning before my hike. After that, he trailed off. Kozlov picked up his wrist gently, examining the watch face. The second hand swept smoothly, precisely. She held it to her ear and heard the faint mechanical heartbeat. Rebecca, what time did Julian usually leave for his hikes? 6:30, always 6:30 exactly. He'd wind his watch at 6, have his coffee, and leave. Kozlov checked her phone. 11:23 a.m. She looked at Julian's watch. 11:23 a.m. Exactly synchronized. Julian walked out of the forest at 6:47 this morning. I checked my watch when I arrived, 6:52. His watch read 6:52. She paused, letting the implications hang in the air. A mechanical watch that hasn't been wound in over a year shouldn't be running. It certainly shouldn't be keeping perfect time. The media descended within days. The story had everything: mysterious disappearance, miraculous return, and the impossible detail of the watch that never stopped. Julian and Rebecca refused interviews, but that didn't stop the speculation. Online communities devoted hundreds of threads to theories: government experiments, alien abduction, secret underground societies, time dilation effects. The rational explanations: that Julian had wound the watch without remembering, that someone had helped him, that the watch was battery-powered despite what everyone claimed, couldn't compete with the mysterious alternatives. Julian struggled with his return to normal life. He'd lost 13 months, but the world had continued without him. His job at the county surveying office had been filled by someone else. Bills had piled up, some of them sent to collections before Rebecca had figured out how to manage everything alone. Friends and family wanted to celebrate his return, but Julian couldn't shake the feeling that he'd lost something essential during his time in the woods, some part of himself that hadn't come back. He suffered from vivid nightmares, or were they memories? He'd wake gasping, convinced he was back under the trees, lost and confused, unable to remember his own name. Rebecca would hold him, whispering reassurances, but she could see the toll it took. The man who'd returned wasn't quite the man who'd left. He was quieter, more hesitant, as if he no longer trusted his own mind. Dr. Patricia Washington, the psychiatrist assigned to Julian's case, met with him twice weekly. She'd specialized in dissociative disorders for 20 years, but Julian's case was unlike anything she'd encountered. Dissociative fugue usually resolves when the person returns home, she explained to Rebecca during a family session. The familiar environment, the loved ones, the routine, these things typically help restore normal memory function. But Julian's memories of the missing time aren't coming back. It's as if those 13 months existed in a completely different state of consciousness. Could he have been drugged? Natalie asked. She'd taken leave from work to help her parents, and the strain showed in the dark circles under her eyes. Could someone have kept him somewhere, kept him sedated? The toxicology reports were clean. No signs of any substances in his system, and physically he's not malnourished enough to have been confined. He clearly had access to food and water, however irregular. Rebecca held Julian's hand, her thumb tracing the familiar calluses. So we just accept that we'll never know? Dr. Washington's expression was sympathetic but honest. Sometimes that's all we can do. The human brain is extraordinarily complex, and we still don't understand everything about memory, consciousness, identity. Julian survived. That's what matters most. But it didn't feel like enough. Rebecca had spent 13 months grieving, had almost held a memorial service, had begun the painful process of letting go. Getting Julian back was a miracle, but it came with complications she hadn't anticipated. She found herself angry sometimes, angry that he'd left, even though it wasn't his fault, angry that he couldn't remember, as if he was keeping secrets, angry at herself for feeling angry. Frank visited in late June, ostensibly to see his brother, but also to assess the situation. He found Julian in the garage, reorganizing the tools Rebecca had begun sorting before his return. "Hey, little brother," Frank said, using the nickname from their childhood. "How you holding up?" Julian set down the wrench he'd been holding. "I don't know. Everyone keeps asking me that, and I don't know what to say. I'm here. I'm alive. I should be grateful. Should be isn't the same as are." "No." Julian sat down on the workbench, looking exhausted. "It's like I'm haunted by myself. By the version of me that was gone for a year. What did I do? Where did I go? Was I happy, sad, scared? I have these flashes, standing on a ridge at sunset, the light golden, sleeping in a hollow tree during a storm, my hands in a creek, washing something, but they don't connect to anything. They're just fragments. Frank sat beside him. Maybe they'll never connect. Maybe you have to make peace with not knowing. How? Julian's voice cracked. How do I make peace with losing a year of my life? The same way Rebecca made peace with losing you, day by day, hour by hour. You grieve what's gone and hold on to what remains. Deputy Kozlov continued her investigation. Though without an obvious crime, resources were limited. She tracked down the hiker who'd reported seeing a disoriented man in Olympic National Park in May. Could that have been Julian? The timeline would fit. She interviewed park rangers, searched for any reports of theft or unusual activity in the area. Julian must have eaten, must have sheltered somewhere. But the wilderness had tens of thousands of acres, countless places a person could hide or wander without being seen. The question of the watch obsessed her. She contacted watchmakers, sent photos and specifications to experts. Every single one said the same thing. A mechanical watch that requires daily winding cannot run for 13 months without being wound. The physics didn't allow it. The power reserve, the stored energy from winding, lasted at most a few days in most mechanical watches. Julian's Seiko had a 40-hour power reserve, according to the manufacturer. Unless someone was winding it, Kozlov said to Rebecca during one of their conversations. They developed an odd friendship, united by their investment in solving the mystery of Julian's disappearance. But he doesn't remember winding it, and who else would have? I don't know. But Rebecca, watches don't just run on hope. There has to be an explanation. Rebecca looked down at her own hands, at the gold wedding band she'd never taken off. Maybe there isn't. Maybe some things don't have explanations. Maybe the watch is just a watch, a small mystery inside a bigger one. In July, Julian started venturing back to the trailhead. Dr. Washington encouraged it. Exposure therapy, she called it. If Julian could return to the place where he'd disappeared, if he could walk the trail without dissolving into panic, it might help him reclaim some sense of control. Rebecca went with him the first time, both of them nervous, both pretending they weren't. The trail looked the same, the Douglas firs, the sword ferns, the creek crossings Julian had known for years. But it felt different, haunted by absence and questions. They walked slowly, Julian stopping frequently to look around, as if the landscape might offer answers. At the viewpoint, they stood side by side at the railing, looking at the valley below. I proposed to you here, Julian said softly. I remember that perfectly. You were laughing because I'd tried to make it this big romantic moment, but I slipped in the mud. You were so embarrassed, Rebecca said, smiling at the memory. But I said yes before you even finished asking. I remember our wedding day. I remember Natalie being born. I remember last Christmas. He paused. But I can't remember yesterday morning. Not clearly. Dr. Washington says it might always be like this. The missing time taking up space in my head, pushing out the present. Rebecca took his hand. Then we'll remind each other. We'll take pictures, write things down, tell each other stories about what we did until the stories become memories. Julian turned to her, his eyes bright with tears. Why did you wait for me? Everyone else assumed I was dead. Because I love you. Because giving up on you felt like giving up on myself. She touched his face gently. And because some part of me always believed you'd come back. I don't know if that's faith or delusion, but it's what got me through. They walked back down the trail together, and for the first time since his return, Julian felt something like peace. He didn't have answers. He might never have answers. But he had Rebecca, he had Natalie, he had his life back, fragmented and strange as it was. That had to be enough. It had to be. That evening, Julian wound his watch, 40 careful turns of the crown, the ritual he'd performed every morning for 30 years. The watch had kept perfect time throughout his absence, through all those lost months. Maybe it was impossible. Maybe it was a mystery that would never be solved. Or maybe, Julian thought as he watched the second hand sweep across the face, maybe some things keep running on faith alone. Maybe that's not supernatural. Maybe that's just love.